On September the 6th, 1949, a neighbourhood in Camden, New Jersey, became the stage for a meticulously planned murder spree. Perched at his second floor window, a man was waiting. He clutched his pistol in one hand, and in the other hand he had a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper was a list of names and addresses of people he thought had wronged him. This wasn't a sudden snap, but the execution of a cold, calculated plan. Over the next 12 minutes, the man would methodically hunt down his victims one by one. But what pushed this quiet, reclusive man to draft such a chilling checklist and then to act on it? This is Red Rum. Stories about the true victims of crime. I upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. Howard Unruh's life had always been one of structure and restraint. He and his younger brother, James, were raised in East Camden, New Jersey after their parents separated. Howard's mother, Frida, worked in a soap factory. The hours were long and it was hard work, but she worked so much kind of because she had to. She needed to support her sons. Howard, who was quiet and book smart, always believed that he was destined for something more, a different kind of life. His high school yearbook described him as shy, but someone who had ambitions of being a government employee. But of course, this is back in the 1940s, and so he's living amongst the backdrop of World War II, and that changed everything for him. Howard enlisted in 1942, and he seemed to his commanding officers to be really disciplined and really devout. He would spend his spare time reading the Bible or polishing his medals. And he'd also be writing heartfelt letters to his mother, who he had an incredibly close bond with. But beneath the surface, there were signs of something darker bubbling. He kept meticulous notes about enemy casualties, down to exactly the details of where the corpses lay after they were dead. And looking at the case now, it seems like a really chilling glimpse into a man who valued control and precision, and also someone who was able to completely separate himself from the death and killings that were happening all around him. Now, he is at war. I'm sure that wasn't massively abnormal to do that. I'm sure you kind of had to do that to get through the day. I mean, how often now are we around death, especially violent death, and so much of it? It just doesn't really happen, especially for me in the UK. I know it's different all around the world, but I would say that the people watching this, it's probably rare that we come across death in such large quantities and of such a violent nature. So when Howard returned home in 1945, he had changed quite a lot. Again, unsurprising, I'm sure that happens to a lot of people who have been in this situation. But to his family and friends, his entire personality had shifted. He found no joy or calm in anything, and on his return, he was described as being moody, being withdrawn, and just generally a very angry person. He moved back in with his mother, and instead of rebuilding his life, he sank further into isolation. Howard would just spend his days reading the Bible, again polishing his medals, and practicing shooting. He actually built a kind of shooting range in his basement, and he would spend a lot of time there. It was around this time that his relationship with his neighbours began to sour. Now, to Howard, every kind of casual remark seemed like a dig. It seemed like a personal attack to him. Even the way that they would look at him made him feel as if they were judging him. One neighbour, a pharmacist called Maurice Cohen, became the target of Howard's paranoia, and soon after he returned home, he really targeted on Maurice. They would have arguments frequently about a whole array of things, but particularly about property access. And it seems just generally, Howard was thought of as a really unfriendly person. People started to notice how reclusive he'd become. There was also this real issue, it seems, of especially the more conservative neighbours. They knew that Howard was having this affair with a man, and they really had a problem with this. Obviously, we're back in the 1940s, and oh guys, I knew it was bad, but as part of this case, I've had to research into what it was actually like in the 1940s and 50s, especially in America. Oh Lord, it was real bad. I know the LGBTQI community can face some pretty grim discrimination now in 2024, and I know it's wildly varied around the world. But here's just some little statistics or little facts about the late 1940s, early 50s America with regards to LGBTQI rights that I found out. So in the early 1950s, the then president signed this order which banned gay people from being able to work for the federal government at all or for its contractors. A blatant discrimination. The order actually listed homosexuals as a security risk. Beyond this, Hollywood actually enacted this Hays Code, it was called, and this basically treated being gay as similar to a crime. The code had rules about how homosexuality could be portrayed in movies, so you can imagine the people watching the Hollywood movies would only sometimes see one portrayal of homosexuality. Suffice to say, it was not positive. Also, slight side note, I try to not make these videos massively political. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not a politician. But true crime is extremely political by its nature. I'm talking about socio-political issues that lead to murder. Things that are often a byproduct of discrimination against minority or oppressed groups. I think that's worth saying because honestly, guys, some of the stuff that I'm learning, and not just about historical decisions on law, but also more current stuff as well. It's just a pretty grim reminder, especially things that I have obviously attempted to block out, which I can do because I live here in the UK, but I think it's only fair to share in my upset and despair. Sorry. So anyway, back to the case, and Howard was mocked and ridiculed for his affair with this man who in the source material is only referred to as the lover or his lover. So that's how I'm going to refer to him from now on. So back to the case, and Howard was ridiculed and mocked for this affair he was having with this man, and in the source material he's only ever referred to as the lover, so just for ease, I'm going to refer to him as his lover or the lover. On the evening of September the 5th, Howard went to the cinema, to the movies, and he was going there with the plan that he was going to meet his lover. They were going to watch some films together. But by the time he got there, he was a little bit late, and he discovered that his lover had left and he was on his own. Now, we don't know the reasons why, but for some reason, he then stayed at the movies. He watched a film, he watched another film and another, and he stayed there all night, and in fact didn't end up leaving until gone 3 a.m. When he returned home, however, he found that a gate that he had installed on his property that was kind of separating his and the next property, the Cohens, it had been removed. That to him was a deliberate provocation by these people who were mocking him. As far as he was concerned, there was no conversation to be had. There was no way to sort this out with words. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. By early the next morning, Howard had decided that that was the final straw. Something I haven't spoken about yet was Howard's relationship with his mother. His relationship with Frida was complex. It was deeply linked to his reclusive tendencies and his growing paranoia. Howard obviously lived with Frida in their Camden, New Jersey home, and she was one of the very few people that he trusted him. Frida really supported him in every aspect of his life. She supported him emotionally and financially, and this was happening more and more, particularly as Howard increased his kind of isolated nature from the outside world. And on that morning after the cinema visit, Howard's paranoia had reached peak. It had reached its breaking point. He had this belief that his neighbours were conspiring against him. They were all in this together. And this fueled his meticulous planning of what would become known as the Walk of Death. That day on River Road began quietly. It was September and the sun was shining, and the neighbourhood really buzzed with its usual kind of morning energy. Frida had left the house to visit her nearby church to do her usual morning activities. Howard was left alone, pacing through the rooms of their house, mentally preparing for what was about to happen. He was replaying the hate that he had for his neighbours and just telling himself over and over again the wrongs that they had done him. Before long, Howard armed himself with a German Luger pistol, and he also got some ammunition together. He had prepared for this day in eerie detail, including creating this list that I spoke about at the beginning, and this was a list of people who he intended to kill. As his mother continued her church visit, she was completely oblivious about what was happening and what was about to unfold. Howard placed himself in the second floor window of the house, and he looked outside. Now at this point it was 9:20 a.m. and he took his first shot. He quickly realised, however, that he wasn't going to be able to shoot any of the people he really wanted to get from this position. And so he popped his gun down for a moment, he grabbed a tear gas pen and a 6-inch knife, picked up his pistol and then headed down the stairs. This is when he began his calculated assault. It would later come out that the reason he so specifically planned to start shooting at 9:20 a.m. was that he knew that most of the shops on his block would be open by then. And so in his mind, that meant that he would have the most chance of creating the mass casualties that he wanted to inflict that day. He began by targeting a man called John Pilarczyk. John worked at the shoe repair shop near the end of the street. The 27-year-old cobbler looked up at Howard as he came in, but as John started to stand up, Howard aimed his gun at him, at his stomach, and he pulled the trigger. There was a little boy who just happened to be nearby, and he was by the counter, so he just kind of hid round the corner of the counter and waited, hoping that this man who had come in with the gun would eventually leave again. And that's exactly what he did. After he'd shot John, he turned around, walked out of the shop, onto the street and got ready for his next victim. He continued a little way down the street until he got to the tailor shop, and when he got inside he realised that the tailor wasn't there, but his wife Helga was. She was alone and she must have seen his pistol because witness accounts say that they heard her screaming. And just seconds later there was a gunshot. He killed Helga right there and then, and after that he simply turned and exited the shop again onto the street and continued his journey. He continued down the street until he reached Clark Hoover's shop. It was a barber shop, and in the centre was this white painted carousel horse that children would go on. They would play on there just while they were waiting for their parents, or sometimes when they were getting a haircut, it would kind of calm them down and make it easier for them to cut their hair. On that fateful day, a 6-year-old boy called Orris Smith was riding the horse. He was having his hair cut by the barber. Trigger warning here, there is a child's death coming up. So his mother, Catherine, was with him, and she was sat on a chair against a wall nearby, and she saw Howard enter into the shop. She looked up, and at the same time Clark, the barber, looked up to see who had just entered. And they watched as Howard marched right up to the boy, and in just seconds he took his pistol out. He aimed it at the boy and he killed him right there and then. He then turned to Clark and shot and killed him as well. And he seemingly completely ignored Catherine, who of course by this point was screaming. She was holding her son in her arms. But Howard didn't seem to even notice her. Instead, he just turned around and left that shop as well, back out onto the street to continue his killing spree. He continued a few doors up to Frank Engel's tavern. And Frank, who had heard the commotion of what was going on, he actually went to retrieve his own gun. There was then a shootout with Howard firing at the tavern door and Frank shooting back. Meanwhile, driving towards them, totally unaware of exactly what was happening, was a television repairman called Alvin Day. Now, Howard must have seen Alvin driving towards him, because as he slowed down, Howard walked up to the driver's side window and he simply fired through the window, killing him instantly. And all this time, Frank, the guy who had been inside the tavern shooting at Howard, he was aiming and trying to shoot at Howard. And he saw Howard pause for a moment in this alleyway. It was somewhere between the barber's shop and the next door, the house that was next door. He aimed and fired, and he did actually hit Howard. But like in some kind of horror movie, Howard got hit, but he just continued on. It was like it hadn't affected him at all. This time, the next person he ran into was an insurance agent called James Hutton. And in the confusion, James had started running down the street, trying to get away from the gunman. To his horror, he had run straight into Howard. And as he kind of tried to get past, Howard raised his gun and shot and killed him right there and then. The next set of victims were the Cohen family. They owned that pharmacy below Howard's apartment where he was living with his mum, and they're the ones who he'd had the argument with about the passage through and the gate that had been put up and then taken down. They had arguments often. And so the next thing that Howard did was he walked into the pharmacy and he immediately opened fire. Now, Maurice had heard this and seen this happening straight away, so he had run upstairs to the apartment and tried to warn his wife, his son, his 12-year-old son, and his mother. His wife Rose shoved Charles, the son, into a closet, and then she herself went to the next door closet and hid in there. She pulled the door to and she waited, just kind of holding her breath, wondering, I'm sure, what was happening. Howard did, however, find Rose in that closet pretty much straight away, and he shot her 3 times through the closed door. Then he opened it up and fired another shot, killing her. He then heard someone moving about in the next room, and as he went through to see who it was, he found Minnie, so the mother or grandmother. She was there and she was fumbling with the phone, attempting to call for the police. He shot her a number of times, killing her instantly, before then proceeding through to the next room. Now, Maurice, meanwhile, had leapt from the window to the porch roof, and he might have thought he was safe there, but what he didn't know was that Howard could see him, and he took aim and fired into his back. Maurice fell from the roof down onto the street, and he lay there still. He was pronounced dead at the scene a little while later. Thankfully, the son, Charles, the 12-year-old boy, he did manage to escape. And actually, I'm going to come back to talk to him at the end of the episode. There's a kind of crazy coincidence that happens there. Back to the street, and another car had stopped at River Road, and it was waiting at a red light. The passengers obviously had no idea what was going on in East Camden at that time. No one had had time to warn them. Howard walked up to the car, and even though it was filled with total strangers, people he didn't know, people who weren't on his kill list, he fired deliberately at them. He immediately killed the 2 female passengers, Helen Matlack Wilson and her mother, Emma Matlack. Helen's son was in the back, and he was badly wounded. When a bullet actually pierced his neck, he was taken to the hospital. Now, although he did survive that initial blast, unfortunately, his injuries were just too severe, and he would pass away just a few hours later in hospital. The list of victims in this case goes on and on. There was a man called Earl Horner who worked in the grocery shop just opposite the pharmacy, and he'd been working that day, and several people had rushed in. They were saying that there was this crazy man shooting, and so he'd locked his door and he locked them all inside. Howard then came up to that door and he just started shooting through the door, trying to kill anyone he could. It was just some wood panelling, so those gunshots, those bullets came straight through. Thankfully, however, all of the people who were inside had hid behind counters or in other different parts of the store, and so they weren't actually hit. It was then that an 18-year-old called Charlie Peterson was driving down the road of that same street, and he was with 2 pals of his. Now, they were driving down when they came across this body on the floor on the street just outside. They didn't know it was the now dead James Hutton, that insurance agent that I spoke about earlier. And so they see this dead body on the road. They don't know what's happening. They're unsure of what to do. So they get out of the car to kind of have a look and see if anyone else is around. And that is when Howard emerged next to them. He aimed his gun at Charlie, who then fell to the floor. He was shot. The other 2 men ran as quickly as they could as far away from the scene. Now, by this time, there had been a flood of hysterical phone calls come in from various parts of East Camden. Police radio cars swarmed into that area. They had their sirens on full blast. So obviously with that, Howard knew the gig was almost up. His time was almost up. And so he retreated back into his apartment, into the house that he shared with his mother. Now, obviously, at this point, Howard had stopped shooting, but it wasn't even that he'd heard these emergency services coming and stopped shooting. It wasn't his choice. He basically had just run out of ammunition, and he initially turned to go back to his flat, his apartment, to get some more ammunition so he could carry on killing. It was 9:32 a.m. that the rampage ended as quickly as it had begun. All of this had happened within just 12 minutes. And police, of course, had surrounded Howard's building, and this had led to a kind of standoff. They were armed with tear gas, guns, machine guns of their own as well. They were just kind of waiting there for what would happen next. One police officer even scrambled to the porch roof underneath Howard's window, and he tossed a tear gas grenade through the pane of glass. Howard knew that his time was up. He knew that he was going to have to do something about this. He couldn't just wait in there forever. Everything was deadly tense and silent, and they just kind of waited for Howard's next move. But then something happened. they heard the sound of a telephone ringing from inside of Howard's apartment. It was a man called Philip, and he was an editor from the Camden Evening Courier. He'd looked up Howard's details in the phone book, and he'd just called him a little after 9:40 a.m. that day. Philip said that he wanted to know what was going on. What were they doing to him? And Howard replied that they hadn't done anything to him yet, but that he was doing plenty to them. And that's when Philip asked how many people he had killed, to which Howard replied, quote, "I don't know. I haven't counted. Looks like a pretty good score." Philip asked why he was doing this, and the response he got was simply that he didn't know and that he was going to have to go because he was quite busy. With that, he hung up. After a brief exchange of some more gunfire, Howard did eventually surrender. Under police interrogation, Howard gave a meticulous account of his actions. These were later released by the county prosecutor, and it's why we have such a clear idea of what happened that day. Howard was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia by psychologists, and he was found to be insane, making him immune from criminal prosecution. He was eventually sent to Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, and he was held in a maximum security prison cell in the Vroom Security Facility. He remained incarcerated there until his death in 2009. Howard's last public words made during an interview with a psychologist were, quote, "I'd have killed 1,000 more if I'd had enough bullets." The Walk of Death, as this case has come to be known, remains as one of the earliest and most infamous mass shootings in America. It revealed the destructive potential of untreated mental illness and unchecked rage, and its victims, both targeted and incidental, became enduring symbols of the fragility of human life in the face of violence. One pretty unreal piece of information I found out when researching this case. Remember the Cohen family? That was Maurice and Rose, who were killed alongside the grandmother Minnie, the Cohens. Well, the 12-year-old boy, the son, Charles, he had survived that massacre by hiding in a closet. That surviving son, Charles, he ended up being the maternal grandfather of Carly Novell. Carly is someone who was in the high school shooting in Parkland, Florida in 2018. She was a student, and she managed to survive by also hiding in a closet, just like her grandfather did back in 1949. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Red Rum. I appreciate you being here. If you have any case suggestions, as always, drop them in the comments down below. Other than that, I will see you in a couple of days for the next episode of Red Rum. Bye.